I never believed in haunted objects. Even growing up hearing stories about cursed mirrors, haunted houses, and possessed dolls, I always assumed there was some logical explanation behind them. That belief stayed with me all the way into my 20s until something happened during my junior year of college that I still can't fully explain. It involved a doll that looked strangely similar to the famous Annabelle doll you've probably seen in movies or photos online. And before anyone says it, no, it wasn't the real one. At least I don't think it was. But whatever it was, I wish I had never brought it into my apartment. It started on a rainy Thursday evening in October. My roommate Chris and I were driving through a small town about 30 minutes outside Hartford, Connecticut. There was this antique shop we passed occasionally on the way back from campus, a place that always looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The windows were dusty, the sign creaked in the wind, and the inside was lit by these dim yellow lamps that made everything look older than it probably was. That night, Chris suggested we stop in because he wanted to look for old vinyl records. I remember joking that the place looked like the kind of shop where someone accidentally buys a cursed object and ruins their life. I wish that had stayed a joke. The inside smelled like old wood and dust. Shelves were stacked with random antiques, clocks, framed photos of strangers, old cameras, and porcelain dolls. Lots of dolls. Too many dolls. The owner was an older woman with gray hair tied back in a loose bun. She barely acknowledged us when we walked in, just nodded from behind the counter while reading a newspaper. Chris wandered toward the back of the shop where the records were, while I drifted through the aisles looking at the weird collection of stuff. That's when I saw the doll. It was sitting on a wooden chair in the corner of the room. It wasn't porcelain like most of the others. It looked like one of those old rag dolls with stitched hands and red yarn hair. But the face was what caught my attention. The eyes were wide and glassy, and the painted smile looked off, like whoever made it tried too hard to make it cheerful. For some reason, I couldn't stop staring at it. I remember thinking it looked exactly like the creepy doll from those Annabelle stories people talk about online. I picked it up, mostly just to show Chris and make fun of it. When I turned it over, I noticed a small tag on the back that read 1970, handmade. The price tag said $15. Chris walked over and immediately laughed when he saw it. "Dude, that thing is nightmare fuel," he said. "You should buy it and put it in the apartment just to mess with people." That's exactly what I did. $15 later, we walked out of the shop with the doll stuffed in a plastic bag. I put it on the back seat of the car and forgot about it during the drive home. Our apartment was on the second floor of a small building near campus. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a small kitchen. When we got back that night, I set the doll on a chair in the living room as a joke decoration. Chris laughed and said it looked like it was staring at him while he watched TV. We left it there and went about our night. The first weird thing happened the next morning. I woke up around 8 and walked into the kitchen to make coffee. The living room chair where I'd left the doll was empty. At first, I assumed Chris had moved it, but when I asked him about it, he looked confused and said he hadn't touched it. We found the doll sitting on the couch. That alone wouldn't have been strange if one of us had moved it, but both of us insisted we hadn't. Chris joked that maybe the doll moved itself during the night. I laughed it off and put it back on the chair. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next few days, small things started happening. Every morning the doll would be somewhere different in the living room. Sometimes it would be leaning against the wall. Other times it would be on the coffee table. Once it was sitting on the kitchen counter. Chris started blaming me, thinking I was messing with him as some kind of prank. I thought he was doing the same thing. Eventually we both agreed neither of us was moving it. The atmosphere in the apartment started feeling different. I can't really explain it. It wasn't like the place suddenly felt haunted or anything dramatic like that. It just felt uncomfortable. Like you were being watched even when you were alone. One night, about a week after buying the doll, Chris and I were sitting in the living room playing video games. The doll was on the chair again, facing the TV. Around midnight, Chris said he was going to bed. I stayed up for another hour or so. At one point, I paused the game and glanced toward the chair. The doll wasn't there anymore. I stood up and looked around the room. My stomach dropped when I saw it sitting on the floor right in front of the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. I walked over slowly and picked it up. I remember saying out loud, mostly to calm myself down, "All right, this isn't funny anymore." I set it back on the chair and went to bed. That night, I had the strangest dream. In the dream, I was lying in my bed exactly the way I had fallen asleep. The room looked identical, but I couldn't move. I remember hearing a faint dragging sound coming from the hallway, something slowly moving across the floor. Then the sound stopped right outside my bedroom door. The door creaked open slightly, just enough for me to see the hallway. The doll was sitting there, watching me. I woke up suddenly, sweating. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking the mattress. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside the window. I told myself it was just a dream. Then I heard something in the hallway, a soft scraping sound. I sat up and listened. It happened again, like fabric dragging across the floor. I got out of bed and opened my door. The hallway was empty. But when I walked into the living room, I felt my chest tighten. The doll was sitting in the middle of the floor, facing the hallway, facing my bedroom. After that night, things escalated quickly. Chris started complaining about hearing footsteps when no one else was home. Once he swore he heard someone whisper his name from the kitchen. We tried to rationalize everything. Maybe the doll was falling off the chair and landing somewhere else. Maybe the noises were coming from the neighbors upstairs. But deep down, neither of us believed those explanations. The final incident happened 2 weeks after we bought the doll. It was around 3 in the morning. I woke up to Chris banging on my bedroom door. When I opened it, he looked pale. "Dude," he said quietly, "did you just come into my room?" I told him no. He shook his head slowly. I woke up and I swear, someone was standing at the end of my bed. My stomach sank. "What do you mean, someone?" Chris swallowed. "I thought it was you at first, but it was too small." We both slowly turned toward the living room. The chair was empty again. We searched the entire apartment. Bathroom, kitchen, closets. The doll wasn't anywhere. Then Chris pointed toward the front door. Something was sitting against it. The doll. It was propped up against the door like it had been placed there deliberately. Neither of us touched it for a long time. Finally, Chris grabbed a towel, wrapped the doll in it, and shoved it into a cardboard box. The next morning, we drove back to that antique shop. The same old woman was behind the counter when we walked in. Chris set the box on the counter and said we wanted to return the doll. The woman looked at us for a moment before slowly opening the box. When she saw what was inside, she sighed. Not surprised, not confused, just tired. She looked up at us and said something that still gives me chills when I think about it. I was wondering how long it would take before someone brought that back. Neither of us said anything. She closed the box and slid it under the counter like she had done it 100 times before. Chris and I left without asking any more questions. We never talked about the doll again after that, but sometimes, late at night, I still think about the way it was sitting in the hallway outside my bedroom door in that dream. And what scares me the most isn't the possibility that the doll moved on its own. It's the thought that maybe it didn't. Maybe something else in that apartment was moving it. And whatever it was, might have followed us home that night from the antique shop. I never planned on bringing a doll into my apartment, especially not one that looked like the kind of thing you'd see locked behind glass in a museum about haunted objects. But the truth is, the night I ended up with it, I wasn't thinking about curses or paranormal stories. I was just trying to help my cousin clean out her grandmother's house. That decision still bothers me years later because if I had just left when everyone else did, I never would have seen the doll sitting alone in that upstairs bedroom, and I never would have brought it home. My cousin Emily's grandmother had passed away in early November of 2022. She lived in an older neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. The house itself wasn't creepy or run down or anything like that. It was actually the opposite. Clean white siding, a well-kept yard, wind chimes hanging on the front porch. The kind of place that looks warm and inviting during the day. But inside, once the family started clearing things out, the house started feeling different. Maybe it was just the quiet. When someone dies, their house has this strange stillness to it, like the building itself knows something changed. Most of the family spent the afternoon packing boxes and deciding what to donate. By the time evening came around, almost everyone had left. Emily asked if I could stay a little longer to help move a few things from the upstairs bedrooms. I agreed, mostly because I felt bad leaving her alone. We started in the smaller guest room first, boxing up old books and clothes. Then we moved to the last room at the end of the hallway. Emily said it used to be her grandmother's sewing room. The second she opened the door, I noticed the doll. It was sitting upright on a wooden chair near the window. At first glance, it looked like one of those old rag dolls you'd expect to see in a craft store. Yarn hair, stitched fabric hands, a faded dress, but the face immediately reminded me of something. "That thing looks like the Annabelle doll," I said without thinking. Emily laughed nervously. "Yeah, my grandma used to joke about that actually." The doll had wide round eyes and a stitched smile that looked a little too perfect. It wasn't necessarily ugly or broken, just unsettling in a way that's hard to describe, like it was trying to look friendly but didn't quite succeed. Emily said it had been sitting in that room for as long as she could remember. Her grandmother apparently bought it at a flea market sometime in the 1970s. "You want it?" she asked jokingly. "Otherwise, it's probably going in the donation pile." I should have said no right away, but instead I shrugged and picked it up. "Sure, I'll put it on a shelf or something." We finished cleaning the room and left the house around 9 that night. The doll rode in the back seat of my car the whole way back to my apartment. I remember glancing at it once through the rearview mirror at a red light. Something about the way the streetlight reflected off its glassy eyes made it look like it was staring straight at me. I laughed it off and kept driving. My apartment was a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an older building near downtown. Nothing unusual ever happened there before that night. When I got inside, I placed the doll on a chair near the kitchen table. I figured I'd deal with it later. The next morning was when things started feeling strange. I woke up around 7 to get ready for work. As I walked into the kitchen, I stopped immediately. The chair where I'd left the doll was empty. I stood there for a second, trying to remember if I had moved it before going to bed. I didn't think so. I checked the living room and found it sitting on the couch. At the time, I assumed I must have moved it half asleep during the night or something. I picked it up and put it back on the kitchen chair. That was the first time it moved. Over the next few days, it kept happening. I would leave the doll somewhere and later find it somewhere else. Once it ended up sitting on the windowsill in the living room. Another time it was leaning against the TV stand. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I was forgetting where I put it. But eventually I knew that wasn't true. I lived alone. There was no one else who could have moved it. The atmosphere in the apartment slowly started changing too. It's hard to explain unless you felt it before. It wasn't like seeing ghosts or hearing loud noises. It was quieter than that. Just a constant feeling like something was slightly wrong. Like the air was heavier somehow. One night about a week after bringing the doll home, I was sitting in the living room watching TV. The doll was on the coffee table across from me. I remember glancing at it a few times without really thinking about it. Around midnight, I turned off the TV and headed to bed. As I passed the table, I noticed the doll had fallen onto its side. I assumed maybe the table shook when I stood up. I placed it upright again and went to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The room was dark and quiet, but there was this strange feeling in my chest, like something had startled me awake. Then I heard it. A soft thump coming from the living room, followed by a dragging sound across the floor. I sat up in bed and listened carefully. The dragging noise stopped after a few seconds. My apartment was completely silent again. I told myself it was probably something falling over in the kitchen, maybe the trash can or a chair shifting. Still, something about the sound made my stomach feel tight. I got up and walked slowly toward the living room. The moment I stepped into the doorway, I froze. The doll was sitting in the middle of the floor, not near the coffee table where I left it, not near the couch, directly in the center of the room, facing the hallway that led to my bedroom. I remember standing there for almost a full minute staring at it, trying to convince myself there had to be a logical explanation. Eventually, I walked over, picked it up, and placed it back on the coffee table. I barely slept the rest of the night. Things only got worse after that. Small noises started happening around the apartment at random times. Knocking sounds from inside the walls. Light footsteps in the hallway when I was the only one home. Once I came back from work and found the doll sitting on my bed, I know for a fact I left it in the living room that morning. That was when I started thinking about the Annabelle stories again. The idea that some dolls are supposedly attached to something else, some kind of spirit or presence. I didn't fully believe that stuff, but I couldn't explain what was happening either. The final incident happened about 2 weeks after I brought the doll home. I was asleep when something woke me up around 3 in the morning. It sounded like whispering. At first, I thought it was coming from outside the building, but then I realized it was inside my apartment. Faint, almost like someone quietly speaking from another room. I sat up in bed and listened. The whispering stopped. Then I heard a slow tapping sound from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I got out of bed and slowly opened my bedroom door. The hallway light was off, but the moonlight from the living room window was enough to see shapes. That's when I noticed the doll. It was sitting right outside my door, facing into my bedroom. I hadn't moved it there. I hadn't even touched it that night. I stared at it for a few seconds before slowly backing into my room and closing the door. I didn't open it again until morning. The next day I drove straight back to Emily's grandmother's house. I knew the family still had the key because the house hadn't been sold yet. I left the doll sitting on the same chair in the sewing room where I first found it. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just said I changed my mind about keeping it. That was the last time I ever saw the doll. But a few months later, Emily mentioned something strange. When the real estate agent showed the house to potential buyers, they noticed a doll sitting in the sewing room chair. Emily said none of the family remembered putting it back there after the house was cleared out. When she told me that, I didn't say anything, because I knew exactly who had brought it back. And I also knew I wasn't the one who carried it upstairs that day.